Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. My name is Chris Richards. As always, I'm your Eclectic Radical this weekend. With me today is my returning comrade, Youri Smouter, the host of the 1+1 program. How are you doing, Youri, and what's going on over there in Europe?
Thank you, Chris. I'm doing all right. Although, for once, you actually mispronounced my last name.
Smouter, yes, Smouter, not Smooter. Thank you.
But that's okay. But no. I'm doing all right. A bit moody weather in Europe, but not too bad. Nothing I can complain about too much. Uh, yeah, no. So yeah, overall doing okay. Overall doing okay. Apart from the world still on fire, though.
Well, and I guess the European Parliament and Chancellery and everything is so irrelevant. I suppose it doesn't matter that the German Greens are taking power in Europe.
Well, this is what's really awful about nowadays politics is you just get the worst of everything. So it's bad enough that we have fiscal conservatives, but now we have to. But when you have them on top of their socially regressivism, and then when you have liberals who are all about the capitalism and not all about the welfare state, or at least providing programs to help you, and then in Germany, for our international audience, you get the worst of everything. So you get a right-wing SPD, then you get your traditional center-right parties, but even our Greens are ghastly and so forth. And
well, so go ahead and give some background for what I'm talking about for people who don't know what just happened.
Yeah, there's a new right-wing coalition in Germany. The main opposition in Germany is the AfD. But what really got under my skin this week is for anyone who does follow German politics and more broadly international politics. There was a coalition government with the SPD, which doesn't even try to pretend that they're for workers' rights anymore. They're just full on NATO socialists, and I don't even know really much.
They've become a traditional third way liberal party. Sadly, I would have to agree with that.
Spot on. And
the SPD, for those who don't know, is the Social Democratic Party of Germany. They are the oldest quote unquote socialist party in Europe. And they have been failing at electrical. They have been proving that socialism and electoral politics have a very hard time working together under a capitalist system since the end of World War I. When they actually found themselves in power and completely failed to introduce anything like a socialist program.
Yes, and it's actually funny that you mentioned that because politics in Germany, certainly since the end of World War II, so post World War II, post Nazism and so forth, the Christian Democrats, which to a degree, if you want to call them compassionate conservatives, by all means, although I think that's giving them some credit, but they were the ones that more or less built up a welfare state and so forth like that, and they were in power for a very long time. There was a brief moment in the 70s, during the Cold War, during détente, where the SPD was back in power, and even then, maybe
Willie Brown, the great Willie Brown.
On the international front, always very.
Willy Brandt, the great Willy Brandt. That did not last very long, and it was preceded. Oh my gosh! And even Willy Brandt was an accomplice to this, and you can't let him off the hook for it, as wonderful a fellow as he was. In 1966, before the SPD actually would take Willy Brandt and the SPD would take power because of the failure of the Grand Coalition, the Christian Democratic Union which was on paper center-right and pro-welfare state, but and did in fact run the governments that introduced the welfare state. But at the same time, the Christian Democratic Union was also a bunch of Catholic liberals, many of whom had supported Hitler. In 1966, the Christian Democratic Union and the SBD were deadlocked in the Reichstag. The electoral deadlock was so complete that neither side could form a government or even any sort of coalition government with any third parties because the deadlock was so complete. And what happened was the quote unquote Grand Coalition, where the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party of Germany formed a government together because there was no other way to do it. And the fucking Social Democrats let the Christian Democratic Union put a guy who had been the assistant director of propaganda for the German foreign ministry under fucking Ribbentrop, prime chancellor of Germany. And so an actual genuine ex-Nazi who had been part of the foreign ministry under Ribbentrop in charge of propaganda during World War II is now Chancellor of Germany in 1966, and he's elected by he's put in power not just by the Christian Democratic Union, but in coalition with the Social Democratic Party of Germany. This was followed very quickly by a series of incidents in which the West German Federal Police shot student protesters with live bullets. Very famous public executions of student protesters. Not even the people who were actually killed weren't even the particularly radical protesters. They were the MLK Jr. type, John Lewis type protesters. But very quickly when this started happening, the actual communists started saying, oh my God, the Nazis are in power and they're going to kill us. And this is when the German Red Army fraction was formed. And we're seeing the Social Democrats and the German Greens show the same sort of collaborationism with the authoritarian fascist West that they were showing during the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, exactly. And then although
let's remember that it's these same West German Federal Police whose response to the Munich kidnappings led to the death of all the hostages because the West German Federal Police were in such a hurry to kill terrorists. Let's not forget that part either.
I actually didn't know you were going to throw that curveball, but
that came right after. That was in 1972, and by that point, the Grand Coalition had actually fallen, and the Social Democrats were about to take power. But still, I mean, that was the same West German federal cops who had been enabled like that by an actual Nazi chancellor in 1966.
And although this is another topic for another day, because I don't want us to get too derailed, but Willy Brandt was apparently there was a East German communist spy within his government, and he was forced to.
Willy Brandt was East German. That's the whole thing. Willy Brandt was from East Germany. He was stuck in the Western sector after World War II, and he couldn't get back because of the way the thing was set up, because he was mayor of Berlin. He was basically a hostage in the US/British/French sectors that became West Germany, even though he was East German.
Wow, that is so
Willy Brandt was from East Germany. He moved to Berlin. Remember, geographically, Berlin is in Eastern Germany, and West Berlin was this capitalist island in East Germany. You have to remember that.
I did not know that. That is so interesting.
Willy Brandt was East German. he moved to Berlin like lots of rural East Germans did for economic opportunity. He was in the Western sector because he was the mayor of Berlin. He was elected mayor of Berlin because in the very first election after the things fell, before they separated into sectors and the Soviets and Westerners started separating their sectors from each other. So he was elected mayor of Berlin in the first elections. And then because of the way that the occupation started to fragment the city, he was essentially kept hostage by the U.S. and British governments in West Berlin for the duration of the Berlin crisis.
And he was definitely a hero to those factions of the Cold War who didn't want us all to die from nuclear annihilation.
Well, Ostpolitik.
Exactly.
The idea that Germany needed to have a relationship with the Soviet Union because half of Germany was East Germany and half of Germany was West Germany, and East Germany was communist, and we all have family in the East. I mean, making nice with the Soviets in order to normalize relations with East Germany was a big deal to him because, again, he was East German.
And and he was, to quote John Lennon, who you can see behind me, he was all about let's give peace a chance and so forth. So he actually went.
And his government.
So he actually went to the Soviet Union and developed proper diplomatic relations.
And that whole East German spy and his government thing, true or not, I mean, and you got to figure it's probably true, and that it's equally true that there were West German spies in the East German government. You've got to figure.
Now that you put it that way, I am actually willing to concede it, because I always thought that it was just a gross smear campaign.
So here's the way I see the thing you got to remember is that during the Cold War, Berlin was the capital of spying. Berlin was the capital of Cold War spying. This is your opportunity to really do something. This is one of the few places where this is like the central to where the other place was Vienna. Lots of stuff was happening in Vienna too. But Berlin was central for things like the Bandera organization. They operated out of West Berlin. The Belarusian group that was pro-Nazi during World War II that was taken over by the CIA. Well, first by U.S. Army intelligence and MI6, and then later the CIA after World War II. They operated out of West Berlin. The two major offices of the League of the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. That's the one I was trying to say. The Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which was all the governments in exile, most of them pro-Nazi, of various real and fake Soviet republics. And they were based in New York and West Berlin. So you got to remember that Berlin was like the center of all this spy stuff. So it's pretty easy to say both governments were absolutely infiltrated by the other side, regardless of what party was in power in West Germany, because, that's just how it worked. These governments were going to be infiltrated by the other side because they're central to this whole spy game. The whole divided state of Germany was, Cold War heaven for CIA and KGB.
Fascinating. Okay, interesting. I
totally believe.
Now that you put it
like that. The thing is that was it Willy Brandt's fault that there was an East German spy in his government? I mean, are we to blame every prime minister who employed are we to blame every prime minister who employed Kim Philby for the fact that there was a Russian spy in the British government?
Okay, because now that you put it like that, I think when you put it like that, it's like, okay, I'm willing to concede, okay, that there probably was a spy in Willy
But
Brandt's
the
government.
real point is
his fault.
His government falling because of this spy scandal. That's totally like CIA propaganda and right wingers blowing it up and everybody making a big deal out of it because he wants to make peace with the Soviets. So it's a big deal that there's a spy in his government because that means maybe the spy is influencing him to make peace. That sort of shit. But that's very different.
I think it's kind, and I think it's kind of a pit. I think it's kind of a pity because.
But
because putting aside some of the skeletons in Willy Brandt's closet, and there are some real skeletons.
And you don't think they caught spies in the West German government when the Christian Democratic Union was in power? I'm just saying.
But that being said, Willy Brandt, I will give him credit is due. His actions at détente, actually being the first German minister post World War II. So always keep that in mind, folks. The first German chancellor, West German chancellor, to go to Poland, to go to Poland and other Eastern European states.
Yes.
Poland is specifically important to what I'm about to say, and basically de facto apologizing for Nazi war crimes.
Yes.
Actually going to the monument of the Warsaw Ghetto uprisings, and he didn't necessarily say so. He didn't. Well, he's actions speak louder than words. The fact that he had nothing to say and was so filled with remorse after putting a huge bunch of flowers and basically going down his knees like somebody who's praying and asking for forgiveness. That is what he did on behalf of his country, not just for Poland but Eastern Europe and by and large the Soviet Union. And for that, I think it was very noble what he did, and no doubt that influenced him getting the Nobel Peace Prize.
And he was
that's institutionist side as well.
And he was a respectable member of the German underground during World War II, and you got to give the German underground during World War II a shout out. They were actually bigger than the French underground, who gets lots and lots of credit.
That is true. So. Yeah, so that was the SPD's very brief period in government, and then the rest is all CDU governments.
But it's worth noting that for all the good things that one can say about Willy Brandt was still the leader of the SPD who agreed to the Grand Coalition, and that put the worst people in charge in Germany, and they gave the West German cops, I keep saying Germany instead of West Germany, but West Germany, put the worst people in charge of West Germany. They gave the German cops an effective license to kill protesters.
Well, and the other dark side about Willy Brandt, which always gets completely overlooked when people do talk about him, and yes, we should give him credit for détente. So I'm okay with him getting a Nobel Peace Prize for that. Unfortunately, as you said, he was a member of the SPD, and the SPD. I mean, Germany is headquarters to, I think, both Progressive Alliance and Socialist International. This is where all the center-left governments.
And remember that Socialist International has become a third-way organization too.
Exactly, and even when those Western European Social Democrats and others of the ilk, even when they actually were, implementing fairly good, socialist policies, they still were
They were Cold War social democrats
to the core, and Willy Brandt supported Latin American right-wing governments and death squads in Latin America, which is ironic because they're eradicating these social democrats who you would think, but that's
the whole thing. I mean, so all the foreign policy stuff, and I am not going to give Willy Brandt any credit beyond his due. I will say foreign policy for any NATO country is pretty locked in to following whatever the official policy of NATO is. And the official policy of NATO is pretty much set by the British and the Americans, more the Americans than the British, no matter what the West Germans, now Germans, like to pretend.
Exactly. They in some ways they made a Faustian pact, but at the same time, while they did make that Faustian pact, and they deserve the criticisms for that, but at the same time, you also do have to wonder, because now I've not read David Swanson and Medea Benjamin's book about NATO, but my good friend Eve Engler, on the whatever anniversary was about NATO, talked in his article about how NATO was also formed to basically eradicate the most radical of social democrats, but also communists, and basically keep them all in line.
The purpose of NATO, and I mean, I'm not. This is my conclusion drawn from the work of people like you cited, and my reading of mainstream history, plus other people who are too many to cite. But from my reading of everything that I've seen, the purpose of NATO was to commit Western Europe to an anti-Soviet foreign policy that essentially surrendered autonomy of individual countries' foreign policy to the U.S. National Security Council and State Department. NATO was also a convenient place to put the rehabilitated pro-Western Nazis into positions without them being too obvious in German government. One of the first a couple of NATO high commanders had served in the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, and for some reason got missed for their war crimes. As if, the fact that they served on the Eastern Front isn't a big red flag that there were death squads working under them.
Exactly.
And then, that was where the worst shit happened. That was where the special service units were rounding people up and shooting them in the head on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, and then when we fast, and then also, a lot of people, say, one of the questions I often ask my communist friends is why your version, why your version of communism and not the Nordic model, or not, or why not a great capitalist model like Luxembourg and Switzerland? And they all, explain to me that those countries, like the Nordic countries, are allowed to have their wonderful social democratic programs as long as they sign up towards NATO.
Well, that's the thing. NATO
gets some of the
NATO subsidizes Western European military and now Eastern European military so that they can have a welfare state at the price of sacrificing their foreign policy autonomy to the United States.
Exactly.
Now, there were limits, and there have been times when NATO leaders, most famously, Lord Harold Wilson during Vietnam, there have been times where NATO members have said, no, we're not going to go along with the U.S. this time. The only people who the U.S. actually had to form a new group, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and get Australia to join in order to pretend that their intervention in Vietnam wasn't unilateral, because none of the other NATO countries wanted to go in with them. So they had to get Australia on their side and form a new treaty organization.
Although funny that you mentioned that, Mark Curtis, a brilliant British historian who looks often cites declassified documents and so forth. Britain still was fairly involved in Vietnam, although just
I'm not saying that the intelligence services and the black ops sort of military stuff wasn't involved.
Yeah.
But officially, as far as the intervention to prop up the South Vietnamese government, there were no British troops fighting in Vietnam the way American troops and Australian troops were. No French, yeah. No Italian, no Dutch. The other NATO countries were not going to go along with it the way they went along with Korea.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
In fact, because that was the period when the USSR was boycotting the UN Security Council, the NATO countries were able to get the whole UN to go into Korea on their side.
Yes, and then going back to our German history, after Willy Brandt is sacked, the CDU continues to dominate the body politic, and then we think, okay, it's the end of the 1980s, it's the end of the Cold War. Finally, Social Democrats can be more radical and so forth, and it's going to be a new golden age.
And that's when Third Way International comes along, and Tony Blair's goons take over the Socialist International, and the French make a gallant rearguard action against this sort of third way neoliberalism that marginalizes them in the international social democratic movement and gets people talking about Mélenchon like he's some sort of communist these days.
Exactly. And during this period, looking back, the 90s, apart from, a few good movies and music, what an awful period the 90s were.
But look at how all the multinational corporate money has been supporting everybody but the French Social Democrats since they didn't join Third Way International and water their product down. And I'm not going to say that the last left-wing French government was even good. It really wasn't. But it's been a long time since they've had one because they weren't willing to become even worse. And so they haven't had the third way money that's put social democratic governments in power everywhere else every now and then.
In fact, we have to give the French credit where we do have to give the French credit where credit is due. When it comes to foreign policy, that's where France is at its most reactionary. But even the French right wing, was very much, and I'm talking about people like Charles de Gaulle and Jacques Chirac and so forth like that. They were not the kind of flame.
Well, yeah, de Gaulle took France out of NATO for years.
Yeah, no, they were not the flaming right wingers that we think of. Like
heck, de Gaulle was probably more left wing than Sarkozy, if you want to be really.
Oh no, exactly. No, exactly. And
but that's the way that you see this third way evolution in European politics, and this leads us right to the German Greens too. But you can see it everywhere from the US to Europe. all of these people who associated themselves with any sort of international third way pro-business trickle-down socialism model got lots of money, had government legitimacy, did a lot to delegitimize the idea of labor parties and social democratic parties in Europe, and drove their own voters further to the right, which led us to the German Greens supporting the CDU in joining the coalition of the willing in Iraq under W.
Oh God. Oh wow, he had to remind me about that. That one really.
The German Greens, the German Greens were in coalition with the Christian Democratic Union. That by itself should be disqualifying for the German Greens as any sort of radical left opposition to the German establishment.
Even before that, but even before that, when we talk about the 90s, under
you froze a moment. It's an internet connection thing, probably again. Like a couple weeks ago. You may need to disconnect and reconnect.
Oh, sorry about that. Internet problems. No, what I was just what I was just going to say was that when we talk about the 90s, so yeah, Gerhard Schroeder gets into a coalition government with the Greens, and they unleash real austerity that on the German people. I just wanted to say that in a nutshell. And as you mentioned, the Greens not only have been in coalition governments with the SPD, but they have been in effing right-wing coalitions with the CDU and supported the Iraq War. And what happened recently in Germany was again, although for a very brief period, we had what was called the traffic light. I think they were called the traffic light coalition. So it was a liberal party, the SPD, and the Greens, and it was basically a repeat of the 90s. So
that's the government that just lost power to the CDU again, isn't it?
Exactly. So just like a repeat of the 90s. So under Angela Merkel, the Germans have just had this uninspiring right-wing government for over 2 decades. They finally, are given they finally are given the boots, although a lot of that is people attacking them from the right, which I don't agree with. But then you have the SPD back in power with the Greens, and they do literally a repeat of what they did in the 90s, both on the domestic front and on the foreign policy front.
Well, let's look at the shaping context for the austerity from the traffic light coalition most recently, because this is actually a great example to talk about the way that Trump has impacted the world for the worst, and that Biden did not really do enough about it. So, what we have been seeing ever since Trump's first term, when he started insisting that every member of NATO raise its defense budget to X percentage of its GDP and total expenditures, there has been a push to find alternate sources of revenue for NATO other than the U.S. Now, what does that mean? That means growing the security states of European nations at the expense of their welfare states, because remember, it's the money they get from the U.S. through NATO that funds their welfare states. So when they start spending more on national defense themselves, they're cutting their welfare to do it every time. So that means when Bill Clinton in the 90s was disengaging and drawing down from NATO, and we were seeing various defense cuts in the interest of, what they're telling us we would get a peace dividend one day. Those cuts by Bill Clinton equaled austerity in Europe, as it meant more support for the European security state by the European national governments. So you see that again under Trump and Biden, because Trump starts making noise, make them pay more for defense, make them pay more for defense. And Biden sort of carries on the no. I think the numbers Trump said were ridiculous, but they should pay more for defense. And now you see with what's going on in what's going on in Ukraine and the public resistance, though in private, businesses as usual, the U.S. is still supporting Ukraine, as witnessed by the fact, and I don't think this can be commented on enough, someone pointed it out, and I'm very glad they did. The reason that Ukraine was able to target Russia's strategic bomber force like that is because there are anti-proliferation treaties that require Russia to make the location of its strategic bomber force known to various UN enforcement groups and to various US and NATO military groups, which means somebody's handing Ukraine the open source intelligence on Russia's strategic bomber deployment, and Ukraine is taking this open source intelligence that Russia is required by international law to provide, and then attacking their strategic bomber force. This is like serious treaty violation, illegal, high-level, dirty trick shit.
Yeah, wow.
Think about it a moment, though. Because what did they do? They attacked the strategic bomber force. What does the strategic bomber force do? The strategic bomber force drops nuclear weapons. So how did they know it was there? Well, the US and or NATO shared the information that Russia is required by international law and treaty to give them. Of course, that's what happened.
Yeah.
And now what we're seeing is you're seeing some of these artificial intelligence people crow about how this is the next thing, how AI is even more important than nuclear weapons now.
Scary shit, actually, when you and I think, and also when we talk about the German Green parties, I think for our American and our Canadian audiences, it's best to describe the Greens like this. They're not like the Green Party of the USA, and they're very much like the NDP in Canada, in which on paper they are supposed to be this green left party or this kind of social democratic party, but then every time they have actually been in power, in practice, they have been just a disgusting war hawk.
The worst kind of pro-Western liberal lickspittles to U.S. foreign policy.
Very much so. And I think when we talk, and you mentioned Ukraine, I think it's a crime against humanity, this ongoing ridiculous proxy war in Ukraine, which even though I'm not supportive of Russia's military actions, I completely understand why Russia did it.
I mean,
for another day. That's another topic for another day. But I just want to say it is the West's fault that we are in the mess that we are in with Ukraine.
The rules.
So when we talk about that, and when we talk about the Islamic fascist takeover of Syria and the ongoing genocide that Israel is doing to the people of Gaza, as well as Lebanon and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, one of those criminals against humanity is yours truly, Annalena Baerbock, who is the now former German Green Foreign Secretary,
yep.
Who sadly, my friends, has been selected, not elected, but selected to be president of the United Nations General Assembly. What the hell can go wrong with that?
So this is clearly the case of, somebody trying to, and we'll probably still see Germany make reasonably decent votes in the UN because they know the US will just veto everything anyway, so they don't actually hurt anybody by voting for it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the one thing I do have to say. I don't like to give Western European heads of state, like the Spanish or the French especially, too much credit for some of the pro-Palestine things they say.
Or
because
Ireland,
ultimately they're still part of the Western establishment that is vetoing it, knowing the U.S. is vetoing any meaningful action. I don't see the Spanish helping the Yemenis intervene militarily in support of the Palestinians. I mean, if the Spanish or the French wanted to put their money where their mouth is right now, they would start building a military alliance with the Yemenis against Israel, and they're not.
Well, and it's the same crock of shit that we're seeing in Canada. So Mark Carney, who's supposed to be Mr. We're decoupling from America because it's no longer like what it was after World War II and so forth. Like, he still is considering signing up for the Golden Dome. He's not at all done any of the things that he claims he's going to do. Like, have alliance with
I want to call out. You mentioned the Golden Dome. You mentioned the Golden Dome. I want to thank you for mentioning the Golden Dome, because the great American leftist foreign policy analyst, maybe the only real professional foreign policy guy we have who's an actual socialist that I know of, Stephen Semler, asked, how much will the Golden Dome really cost? And he quoted a $1.25 billion number that the Trump administration quoted, and he said, wrong. And he quoted a $525 billion number that the New York Times quoted, and he said, wrong. And then he said the truth, which is that the Golden Dome is a scam against the U.S. military and by the U.S. military industrial complex against the U.S. government. And so its cost is infinite. The U.S. government will dump as much money as it chooses to pay down that hole, and it will only run out when the U.S. government chooses to stop being scammed.
Oh, so that's why it is very much favorable. Having read Eve Engler's assessment of what the Golden Dome is, that's why many anti-imperialist critics have said that this is basically Reagan's Star Wars program.
Yes.
All over
and
again.
And there are two things to remember about Reagan's Star Wars program. Number one, it was a very costly scam that cost billions of dollars without one defense system ever being launched into space to protect us from Russian missiles. Number two, it was the reason nothing was ever launched into space under Reagan or Bush or Clinton, and both Bush and Clinton sort of continued playing around with it, even though they officially backed away from it.
Yeah.
Was because it violated all the nuclear non-proliferation treaties, and deploying a missile defense system would essentially be a repudiation of the entire arms control system in place, and essentially be an open arms race like the worst parts of the Cold War before the arms control process started. This ties into what you were saying about what I was saying about the attack on the strategic bombing force in Russia. That is also an attack on the arms control protocol in place by AI companies who believe their technical military expertise is a more useful weapon of mass destruction than nuclear weapons, and consider this Ukrainian attack on the Russian nuclear force a commercial for their product.
But a a quick aside to that, let me then play devil's advocate. What would you say to the stand with Ukraine? yeah. What would you say to the stand with Ukraine folk? To the stand with Ukraine folk who say, well, Russia's the aggressor. Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to protect its sovereignty, and the only way that Ukraine has any chance, they do have to strike.
Why does Ukraine have why does Ukraine have the right to protect its sovereignty? What is it doing with its sovereignty? What about its sovereignty requires us to respect it? Now, I want to say before people go off on me for being pro-Putin, because I have a very simple line on the Ukraine war, which I believe is much simpler than Israel-Palestine, which is really simple. The line on the Ukraine war is just the traditional socialist line on imperialist wars. This is a struggle between an imperialist hegemony and a sort of junior member of that hegemony who has been gradually pushed more and more to the fringes as it has lost its ability to project power internationally. And Russia is doing everything possible to show that it can project power internationally to force its way back into the inner circle. They want the G7 to be the G8 again. They want to have the sort of importance on the world stage that they had before Boris Yeltsin and the fall of the Soviet Union, which is, that's all well and good. I think that that's kind of a stupid goal to have when you consider that you don't have the resources that the USSR had. You don't have the systems in place that the USSR had. And most importantly, you don't have the wells of popular support, both at home and internationally, in the same way that the USSR had it during its heyday. Yes, there's a lot of middle class and what I would call Communist Party class disaffection with the Soviet system because they wanted to have more of the freedoms and good things that they saw the ruling class in the West get.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there was always a real understanding, well, this system is what keeps people alive and gives us a certain standard of living in the world. And, that standard of living collapsed completely when the USSR fell. It was the only thing that I think I would ever agree with Putin for saying is the degree of the humanitarian disaster that occurred when the USSR fell and the Western government neoliberalized Russia without even significantly involving Russian capitalists, just basically colonizing Russia and allowing many Russians to be put at risk of death. And many only survived because they basically took over and maintained the last Soviet dakas in their neighborhoods and ran them as communal gardens and communal farms and shit.
I like how my friend and colleague Boyan Stanislavski of the Barricade, who's Polish Bulgarian, he has described, what happened to Russia post-Cold War, but also that entire bloc, Eastern Europe, Eastern Europe bloc, and its brutal transition to disaster capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. But he describes it as a civilizational downgrade.
And we are being interrupted again, but I definitely have to agree with the statement there. Capitalism is always a civilizational downgrade.
Exactly. And didn't want to get too bogged down onto Ukraine, but I recently saw two documentaries by a French documentarian about what was going on in Donbass before Russia's invasion, and it's pretty horrific what Western-backed Ukraine did to the people of Donbass.
Well, the Ukrainian National Guard.
And being said, and I'll even send you links to so that you can share what you know with your audience. But again, the people who keep saying that evil started when Russia invaded Ukraine are not being honest with you, and are also lying to themselves. This started because of Western imperialism. Not saying Ukraine is that, but Western. Again,
well,
like
there's a simple
Western imperialism is literally the root is literally the root of all evil, and folks really need to check out these two documentaries that this French documentary filmmaker did. It's horrific what the Western-backed coup government was allowed to do to the Ukrainians of Donbass and Donetsk is grotesque, and not many people have done it. And I think if people look at this documentary, they'll conclude one of two things. They'll conclude that Russia was entirely in the right, or they'll make a version of what I said, which is even if you don't support Russia's military actions, the West had it coming.
Russia and Ukraine are both undeniably committing war crimes. And I say both very deliberately because you have in Mariupol the real life version of the fictional argument that the Israelis have all the time about the Palestinians. In Mariupol, you have the situation where, yes, the Ukrainians genuinely used a hospital as human shields. A hospital full of pregnant women was deliberately used as human shields against the Russian military, and the Russian military attacked the hospital anyway. So you have both war crimes being committed by both sides. The Ukrainians should not have been using human shields, and Russia should not have deliberately attacked a hospital, period. But there you are. You have that situation where both sides are clearly doing something they shouldn't do. And the side that's attacking a hospital has a certain degree of legitimacy, even though they should not have attacked the hospital, because there really were human shields, and that part can't be denied. Now, that said, the Ukrainian National Guard had no business using a hospital as the headquarters. And ultimate responsibility has to go to the fact that the Ukrainian National Guard knew what they were doing, chose to use the hospital as a headquarters, and chose to use pregnant women as human shields. All that said, the Russians still attacked a hospital. That's still a violation of the Geneva Convention. If we were really hauling people to The Hague, we should be hauling both of the leaders responsible for the defense of Mariupol and the leaders responsible for the attack on Mariupol into The Hague, and give the people of Mariupol the chance to testify against both sets of jackasses. Now, we don't have a system that allows that to happen. We have a system in which the best that anyone can do, if they really oppose what the U.S. has done in Ukraine since the Cold War, because let's be honest, it's not just Western imperialism. It's very specifically Anglo-American anti-communism, which is openly aligned with Nazism in the historical context of of the whole development of the modern Ukrainian state.
And this is why it's awful to have somebody like Annalena Baerbock, who is now president of the UN General Assembly, and
because let's remember that there is a culture built up by the Cold War support for the Ukrainian People's Movement. And the Ukrainian People's Movement made heroes, deliberately chose to make heroes out of the UPA of the 1950s and the UON, the ONW, the OWN of Organization of Ukrainian National, OUN.
Yeah.
The OUN of the World War II era. So they made anti-communist heroes out of Nazis because the communists were the villains they needed to beat. But that means that everything that has happened in the Ukrainian state since is based on its founding in a context of aggressive anti-communism. And aggressive anti-communism is always a cover for fascist repression.
Oh yeah, definitely. And somebody like Baberbog, I just wanted to quote my friend Alfred Desaias when I asked him if he could comment on her being appointed to the president of the UN General Assembly. He said that Baberbog's election again demonstrates in what state of decadence the United Nations finds itself. Her previous career reveals an attitude incompatible with the principles and purposes of the UN. I'm just going to go one step forward. I think, when we talk about, I don't know, I think again, it also just, I think it also is just the, I think we're just hitting a fever pitch of just how much to the right the whole world has shifted from not only social democrats but also green parties. And at the same time, I also just don't think that the West even cares anymore in even trying to maintain any form of credibility. Any form of credibility, if that makes any sense.
I'm going to read a couple of things together. First, a poem by an Irishman, and then a quote by a German. There we go. That's what so now I've got everything I want. So first, the poem. Now this is going to be a bit longer. This is The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. So trigger warning Christianity, folks. But there's also some good stuff in here that's worth commenting on in the first verse. When we get to the second verse, the Christianity starts to become aggressive, but it's still worth listening to because it's great poetry. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight, somewhere in the sands of the desert. A shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it, real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Now, I think I lost Youri while I was reciting, and I was going to ask his opinion about that. But while we try to get him back, I'm just going to go ahead and say, here we go.
Sorry, folks, internet issues.
Hey, how much of that did you hear, or do I have to go again?
You might have to go. Yeah. Unfortunately, you have to go again.
I'm so sorry, everybody. Well, maybe I'll read it just a slightly better on the second time. We'll see. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Now let's stop right there for a moment before we even go on to the second verse. Does that not fucking describe what's going on right now?
In a nutshell.
Now Yeats was writing this. Let me try to find the date. Come on.
And actually, just a reminder, while Chris is doing that, donate to Patreon to the Eclectic Radicals to support independent media.
Yeah, the second coming is either World War I or near the end of his life, and I can't remember which. That's what annoys me. But near the end of his life was just before World War II. So that's equally dramatic with World War I, and all the same things apply. And it's a really good description of the problems of modern capitalist liberal democracy, regardless of era.
Exactly.
And then I'm going to go into the second stanza. This is where all the religious stuff comes in. It's extremely Christian, and it gives you. This is what the normal, everyday Christian, in my opinion, this is what someone should think when they look at the state of the world, and they shouldn't see it as a good thing. Because compare the tone of what Yeats is saying to the tone about the second coming that evangelicals grasp today, please. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know. The 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Damn.
Now, Yeats thought the second coming was at hand, and he was scared the fuck out of his mind. Now, that's the first thing that I want to say. This is how the normal Christian reacts to the kind of conditions that we're facing today. And the people who are embracing this sort of, oh my God, it's great, we're going to have the end of the world and we're going to be going to heaven and everything's going to be awesome. Those people are not doing Christianity right, and there's some kind of drug in their system that needs to get out.
Exactly.
And I say this despite being pro-drug in most cases. They took the brown acid.
No, exactly. And
so now I've got my second quote. This is much shorter. The person who said this was a young German woman named Gudrun Ensslin, who went on to be one of the founders of the West German Red Army fraction. Okay. She was reacting to the death of an anti-Vietnam War and pro-civil rights protester named Benno Onsorg, who had been shot in the head by the German federal police with a live round in a student protest and killed instantly. They'll kill us all.
Against the Vietnam War.
Against the Vietnam War and and in favor of the civil rights movement.
Okay.
They'll kill us all. You know what kind of pigs we're up against. This is the Auschwitz generation. You can't argue with people who made Auschwitz. They have weapons and we haven't. We must arm ourselves.
That's the whole poem?
That's not a poem. That's the whole quote. That's what she said. Straight into the point. These are the people who built Auschwitz. You cannot argue with the people who built Auschwitz. Now, we are dealing right now with the people who built the camps that Trump is holding people in before he sends them to El Salvador or Libya or wherever he sends them. And the people who built the camps are not just Republicans, but Democrats and German Greens, and Australian Greens, and Australian Labor, and British Labor, and Macronistas in France, and Canadian Liberals. These people all built the camps before Trump ever took power and started using them this way.
So, folks, spare me the I'm going to be moving to Canada nonsense, and spare me the nonsense that Europe is so much better than, and the grass is much greener in Europe compared to the U.S. It's not having, having the unfortunate ethnicity
as a
made up living here and all that jazz.
As a codex to the Gudrun Ensslin quote. Gudrun Ensslin died in prison. It was said that she killed herself, and a CIA agent testified to the West German Court of Human Rights that he kind of thought that the West German government killed them and made it look like suicide.
Jesus.
So one of Gudrun Enslin's comrades, who allegedly killed herself several days before the rest, Ulrike Meinhof, who was one of the two founders whom the West German media would name the Red Army fraction after. They called it the Baader-Meinhof gang, delegitimizing its actual political purposes and implying that they were criminals. Ulrike Meinhof said, "You cannot fight for liberation if you're dead. If they say I committed suicide, be sure it was murder." And then she commits suicide. Just saying.
Yeah. And here's hoping that the clusterfuck of a situation in Ukraine ends soon and cooler heads prevail.
This actually, I mean, I hate to say it. I don't want to push disaster refugeeism on anyone. But if you want to gentrify the rest of the world, which is not my recommendation, but if you do want to flee somewhere, number one, Uruguay has universal health care. Number two, Uruguay has, at least until they start closing their borders in retaliation, Uruguay has a program where people who want to work in Uruguay and become citizens can immigrate to Uruguay, get help learning Spanish and getting certified for whatever business licenses they might have in the U.S. or whatever university degrees they might have in the U.S. or Europe or wherever, get those transferred over in Uruguay and fast track you to naturalization. So if you're really looking to flee someplace and you want to help support a country against imperialism when the U.S. eventually get there, Uruguay is the place to go. And folks, for everyone who might be interested, that is my wife. And yes, she got it right.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yes, she got it right. Very good. But yes, Uruguay has a program for people who want to relocate to Uruguay if they are willing to learn Spanish.
I think it sounds like a pretty good. I'm gonna keep that in mind. I'm gonna keep that in mind. I'm gonna keep that.
Just remember, if you go to Uruguay because you're on the run where you are now, you have to commit to actually fighting for Uruguay when things start to get bad there.
I think that sounds like a pretty good catch. So I'm having a hard time already emigrating to countries I want to move to. So if shit really hits the fan, I think I might just take that Uruguay proposition. All right, let's switch it up a bit.
I do want to reiterate again. I generally don't support relocating to somewhere else simply because so many people can't, and it's if it's possible, it's better to fight where you are now. But if you are willing, if you are really willing to commit to fight for Uruguay when the time comes, then that's the place to make your last stand, I guess.
Let's switch gears a bit because Ukraine and European politics really depresses me. But let's go on to an equally depressing subject. Our good friend RFK Jr. Said the following. He said this about autism, and it's he says about autism, and I read this in a very short article. He said the following about autism, that it destroys families.
Yes.
And he said the following. He said children with autism will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. And they'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. I'm just going to say the following. I actually prepared, some bullet points word for word, in response to RFK Jr.'s disgusting ableism. And I'll just
some
say
of the best independent journalists I know are on the spectrum. So shout out to Justine Barron.
And I don't even know where you even start with RFK Jr.'s grotesque ableism, but I'm just gonna spitball and read out some bullet points I made. All my life, the older I'm getting, the more I realize that all my life I've had many people on the autistic spectrum in my own classrooms, and many of them are very good at mathematics and science. But you could say they excelled at all subjects. Some of my peers and others, we actually didn't even know that we had people within our midst that had Asperger's syndrome until the teachers told us, or they told us themselves in this particular setting, and. So that's already a huge pushback and a fuck you to RFK Jr.'s dumbass stuff. I have to say, none of them were more socially awkward than the average Joe and Jane.
Hey, there was a whole TV show, propaganda to be sure, but all the same, there was a whole American TV show called Bones that was all about that. While it was never said outright, was under the table all about normalizing certain autistic behaviors to the public and making people think that a certain kind of person was cute and interesting and fascinating instead of scary and weird.
Exactly. And I just have to say, I don't even know where you even begin with this, but there are countless autistic people, and I'm talking countless autistic people who can do all the things RFK.
The vast majority of autistic people do all the things that RFK Jr. said in that awful quote that they would never do. Justine Barron and I actually did a show close to the time where he said that, where we both tore into RFK Jr. and we really pointed out that folks who are criticizing him about measles vaccines now were sure helping him a whole lot when he was telling people not to wear masks and they didn't have to take public health about COVID seriously. Because it was that whole reaction against COVID from liberals that made him legitimate.
Exactly.
When it was just reactionaries, nobody was paying attention. But when liberals started to legitimize it, RFK Jr. was really empowered.
Exactly. And I just have to, I also wrote this that, that there are countless autistic people who can do all the things RFK Jr. said that they couldn't do, including the arts, for fuck's sakes. And I also wrote, for fuck's sakes, is this asshole not aware of the Special Olympics? And does he not know about the real-life Rain Man Kim Peek? And also, important to say the following.
Have you ever heard of Temple Grandin, who won a Nobel Prize?
Exactly. But also, not all autistic people need to be in a special ed class, but even those who truly have a severe level, even those ones who were in classes like mine, if you just gave them simple extra supports, they could excel at whatever subjects and even be integrated. And I hate to use this term. They not only could be integrated in society, but they could assimilate in society.
I have a mutual follower, not someone I'm super close with, but a mutual follower, and their stuff popped up in my feed on this topic because it's hasn't gone away since RFK Jr. started shooting off his mouth. They said, hey, they were nonverbal once. They were labeled as low functioning. They were shut. Their parents treated them like they couldn't do anything, and they shut down, and they had no reason to do it. And one day somebody gave them the internet, and they got on the computer, and they started talking to people on the internet. And after they started talking to people on the internet, they opened up in real life because it helped socialize them. And they also got away from their shitty family once they were old enough and actually got a job on their own, which they were able to do as sort of a fuck you to their family. And it's like, people don't understand how much of this focus on many of the worst people isn't even a real focus on people whose disorder is as severe as people are saying. It's that their social reaction to the way they're being treated is a reaction to abuse.
But also,
these autism parents who are saying we need to get rid of autism, it's our kids are such a burden, I wish they could be normal. These autism parents are not advocating for their kids, they're advocating for themselves.
Actually expound on that a bit more before.
So if you study, disabled Twitter is a great place to discuss the disconnect between listening to the caregivers of disabled people talk about disability and listening to disabled people talk about disability. Now, many people with autistic children are abusing their children because they resent their condition and are the cause of their of the behavior that they blame on autism. And the problems that their kid has are problems that they might have even if they were not autistic, if their parent were treating them like they were worthless.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying.
And there's a lot of advocacy. I don't know how it is in Europe, but I know how it is in the United States. There's a lot of advocacy for quote unquote autism research that is not driven by serious interest in helping autistic people have a better quality of life, but is rather focused on eliminating autism in a way that centers the people who have to take care of autistic family members.
Mm-hmm.
And I put scare quotes around the words "have to take care of," both because that really is their story. We're not hearing their autistic relatives' side of the story. We're not hearing what their autistic relatives would say about their caregivers if asked.
Actually, and it's interesting what you were saying, because I also I made a note of this, in response to RFK Jr. Now, yes, so I'll just read what I wrote. Now, I just wanted to make this point that while I do think it's great and we should support programs that help all disabled people, from those with physical handicaps to severe mentally disabled people, to be fully integrated into society, I do have a problem on the whole. If someone is gifted or is great at sports, then they are and they are worthy of praise and money, then they are worthy of getting welfare, disability payments, and stuff like that. And I just have to say that there's this kind of grotesque, sadistic appetite that we have
Yes.
for penalizing people who aren't able to work and so forth. So again,
It's
I'm all
almost
for, so again, I just want to make it very clear, because I know even when writing this down, I didn't explain myself very well. So I'm all for the full integration of people who are disabled, who do have whatever level of autism, but I also am against this whole idea that, like, if somebody is a Kim Peek, or if somebody is a real life champion at Special Olympics, then we should be propping that up and so forth. When I also think at the same time, look, if somebody isn't able to work, don't penalize them. Don't think that they're
well.
they're unworthy and so forth, because even in that person's day-to-day life, even if they may not be able to do a full-time job or any job, we should still make their quality of life very good,
Well,
and they
Western
still are a good person to
Western liberalism
society.
says that invites moral hazard, and it's safer to let them die. Now, why that is the case, I'm not sure, but there is a strong belief among the propagators of Western liberalism, all the way back to the very good old, bad old, whatever you want to call them, days of Queen Victoria, that people who are too disabled to work are also too disabled to really enjoy their lives. And liberal utilitarianism says it's just not fair that we let these people who will never be happy make other people unhappy. Because liberal utilitarianism is based on the happiness principle, where you want the largest segment of society possible to be happy, even at the expense of other segments of society, if it's really bringing the largest amount of happiness into the world. And these utilitarian calculations about happiness, the important question that has to be asked is whose happiness? These liberal ideas about calculating happiness tend to work to the expense of at the expense of unhappy people, because it's easier to protect the happiness of people who are already happy than it is to make unhappy people happy. So we just need to get rid of the unhappy people and there will be more happiness. Now, if that doesn't seem obvious, then let me go back to RFK Jr. to illustrate what I'm talking about. RFK Jr. wants to eradicate autism, he says. Okay. So he's not saying that he wants to cure autism. He's saying he wants to eradicate autism. He wants to find out the cause of autism so he can prevent there from being more autistic people. That's what he says. Okay. So he finds the cause of autism. He does whatever is necessary to eliminate the cause of autism. That doesn't eliminate autism. We still have all the autistic people who are still around. So now you haven't cured autism. You've just figured out what caused it and prevented any new cases from happening. So how are you going to eliminate autism? The autistic people are still around. And then it becomes obvious. They're going to tuck the autistic people away somewhere out of sight, out of mind.
And he has actually said that on...
Yes, forced labor camps. He described them as relaxing farms. But, even though we
already have versions of that already kind of exist. Some, of course, are much better than others, but still.
He wants these specifically for autistic and other disabled people, largely because he seems to believe most disability is mental illness, but that's a whole nother topic.
Oh, yes, and we know how his family treats those that do have mental illness, right?
Yes, his grandfather lobotomized his aunt.
Unbelievable. Really sickening when you really, when you really process that and you really think about that. It's really sickening. It's a bit of an overabused term because the fucking COVID denialists co-opted it, but it really is like neo-eugenicist in a nutshell.
There's nothing neo about it. Remember, Joseph Kennedy Sr. was, around in the 1920s, 1930s. He was one of the eugenicists. So when RFK Jr. is a eugenicist too, that's just the family. His grandfather was all in on that stuff. His grandfather had to be fired as ambassador to the court of St. James because he was having conversations with the Nazi ambassador to the UK after he was having conversations with the British government. And so the UK asked FDR to fire Joe Kennedy as ambassador to the UK.
Unbelievable.
JFK's daddy was spying on the British for the Nazis because he was Irish and because he kind of liked Hitler. And it's just important to remember this. And that's who RFK Jr.'s grandfather was. And consider that his grandfather outlived his father and was therefore probably much more of an influence during his childhood.
I'm a bit just at a. Sorry to the audience. I'm a bit of a deer in the headlights right now, but because it is just so shocking. Because. And I don't know, like RFK Jr. This might be changing the subject, but we can go back to, but we can go back to talking about this very important topic in a moment. But I don't know. RFK Jr. also has just some, he was, he's the health secretary, and he was talking about how he wants to force schools in the U.S., mainly public schools, to talk more about nutrition and emphasize eating healthy foods. And okay, look, I'm not against that. Like, yes, it is true that we all should be, vegetarians,
but
vegans, and whatnot.
I'm skeptical. So I want to stop you for a moment.
Wait. Let me finish. My problem, though, with that thesis, which I'm not against, is RFK Jr. He does know that a lot of healthy foods are contaminated by the sugar cartel, by whatever, Monsanto, DuPont, whatever we spray in the fucking farms and in our meats.
Yeah.
We literally shoot, our cows and stuff like that with all sorts of.
So here's the thing. Here's the thing. His solution, and this is a whole show on itself, because you can't talk about this without talking about the cultural origins of a lot of stuff that we think is flaky liberal that's really, really aggressively Nazi. But RFK Jr. is part of a quote-unquote organic foods movement that is a rejection of modern health science. When he talks about healthy foods, he's not talking about, I want to make sure we have corporate enforcement of health standards. He wants people to not be going to the supermarket and instead be going to some expensive Amish farmers market where they can buy raw milk and unpasteurized dairy products and meat that hasn't been inspected by health inspectors. Because that's better for you. It's organic. So he's got this notion of natural that rejects every good thing that ever came from our understanding of infection control or being able to genetically modify organisms to, say, prevent famines in India.
Yeah.
Because it's important to understand that this organic foods movement that RFK Jr. has latched onto in this area is not really about healthy eating. It's about it's about a return to primitivism in the food supply, that though it sounds like it would benefit Amish small farmers somewhere, is really a total rejection of any sort of regulation of big ag. Because if we're not regulating big ag in any way, in the sense that milk doesn't have to be pasteurized and meat doesn't have to go through government inspections, well, what's good for these little organic producers is good for big corporations too, unless you're doing something to shut big corporations down. So when he talks about being anti-big ag because he's pro-organic farming, the pro-organic farming he's for would lead to famines in Ethiopia and India and death all around the world, because we're primitivizing our production on the one hand, and on the other hand, it would, in places where this primitivization is still carried out by big landlords who own large amounts of land and employ borderline slave labor to harvest their crop, we're not actually doing anything against corporatism. We're just, making it easier for the corporatists to cut costs and avoid red tape. And that takes us back to the point before Teddy Roosevelt even decided that maybe there shouldn't be poison in medicine.
And yet,
maybe there shouldn't be poison in food.
But you gotta give credit where credit is due. RFK Jr. is a master grifter. It's actually quite unbelievable, because
he sees the whole thing as spiritual and more. Yes, it's about purity. The word is purity. And all these annoying, obnoxious people who are like, we can't purity test on the left. You don't understand. Purity is a Nazi obsession. We just want you to be anti-Nazi.
But it's incredible. But it is incredible how much of a master grifter he is, because he does take a lot of these legitimate concerns that we do have, but his solution isn't that. I mean, I've always said this about RFK Jr., and I was always very puzzled at the left-leaning folks who were supporting him. And I said the following about RFK Jr.: he's not Bernie Sanders, he's not Dennis Kucinich, and he's not even a Ralph Nader.
But
In
the
best
bad
sense.
news, bad news is that even your Dennis Kucinich's and Ralph Nader's, until far too recently, saw RFK Jr. as sort of an ally, even though they would have to criticize him a whole bunch on other things because of certain alleged positions, like, oh, he was supposedly such an environmentalist. Well, sure, he was a guy who did boutique environmental law that benefited rich people who wanted to be able to boat in their section of the river. But he doesn't think you should stop people from dumping sewage in the pond. He just thinks you should let people swim in the sewage.
Yep. And let's really be honest. We have to be honest. I know there's a tendency among the left, if you say one critical thing about such and such a person, you're never going to ever become the rock star journalist you want to become. So let's not beat around the bush. RFK Jr. became very popular amongst left-leaning people and anti-imperialists because they thought he would be. First of all, they got fooled by his overrated name.
They made the mistake.
They got fooled by his overrated name.
They made the mistake.
Really, it's all because of the COVID denialism.
Well, that's the thing. He understood that COVID denialism was his ticket to a bigger audience and to the kind of audience that would support him no matter what, that he wasn't finding as a quote unquote liberal progressive Democrat. And so it was an opportunistic shift for a guy who really had no core morals. And yes, Jimmy Dore really did a lot to jump on all this COVID grifting because he was taking money from a guy who was associated with the intellectual dark web, who wanted to see these Brett Weinstein and Barry Weiss type thinkers promoted. And that lots of Jimmy Dore fans ended up getting sucked into the People's Party and then the American Communist Party and all this sorts of weird right-wing syncretism shit under the label of quote-unquote first populism and then patriotic socialism and MAGA communism and all these stupid labels, when really it's just this excuse to buy into right-wing conspiracy theories that you think you can make money off of.
Exactly. And and RFK Jr., now it's somewhat, although he still has his core, supporters on. I wouldn't even call them lefters. Call them libertarians that have one or two good lefty opinions, but it's just libertarianism in a nutshell. Well, that's why RFK Jr. is very popular.
I think,
and RFK Jr. was propped up also by the Gray Zone. We know that Max Blumenthal did lots of footsie and was also propping up a lot of COVID denialism and whatnot, and the don't get your vaccination rallies and so forth like that. They all only turned on RFK Jr., including Dennis Kucinich.
Yes.
They all started to turn on RFK Jr. when RFK Jr. started to open his mouth about Palestine, and that was when the genocide was going on.
Dennis Kucinich is himself a believer in syncretistic movements who has repeatedly tried to latch himself on to Ron Paul, despite Ron Paul repeatedly saying, I don't really want anything to do with Dennis Kucinich. I'm glad he's running and he's out there and he's doing what he's done, and I really support it. But I don't agree with him about anything except that we need third parties.
Well,
But
and
Dennis Kucinich keeps trying to do this syncretistic. Well, the libertarians are our friends, and we can and it doesn't work that way. But he's part of that whole fake news on the left establishment that tries to sell this right-wing populism as something that left-wingers can make use of. And it's just stupid. It's
well, yeah. I mean, I've long ago have also I've given up on this whole idea of the whole left-right thing. I know the late Alexander Coburn was a big champion of that. I read Ralph Nader's book and about trying to do a left-right coalition. But my whole problem
the
is
whole idea of a left-right coalition is that the left and the right don't want any of the same things. This goes right back to the Grand Coalition in West Germany in 1966. What do you get when you get a coalition between right-wingers and social democrats? You get a right-wing government.
And actually, if you really think about it, at the end of the day, it also doesn't even matter what kind of left policies got passed. It really doesn't matter because the right wing shit, the Nazi shit, overtakes whatever minimal left wing stuff you were. And you end up just getting just right wing nonsense in the end.
Because ultimately it's all the actual interests of the ruling class align with the right, no matter how anti-establishment the leaders of the very farthest right claim to be. It's not that they're anti-establishment, it's that they want to take over the establishment and be the establishment, which is a very different thing.
And I've always said the following, that I don't mind leftist voices, left-leaning voices. By all means, okay, go on Fucker Carlson, go on this right-winger's platform, go on that right-winger's platform. By all means, you can
don't lick Tucker Carlson's spittle, though. Don't say you think Barry Weiss is someone important that people should listen to.
And my hope, but the conclusion I've also made is by all means you can go on all of these, on all these right wing platforms, but if you're coming out of those right wing platforms and you're engaging in soft xenophobia, or you're engaging in COVID denialism, or you're engaging in transphobia and whatnot, then you have just proven the point of why a left-right coalition doesn't work. You've allowed yourself to basically become co-opted with the right wing. And if you think, wow, I can cross out disabled people, I can cross out trans people.
You've become a right winger. You have sold out your values in order to do the quote unquote most good. And now you're oppressing the working class alongside the fascists.
Which is kind of ironic given how a lot of those people who play footsie with RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard and still want to prop up Jimmy Dore and so forth. The irony of all of that is that a lot of them are Palestine champions, and a lot of them are, we're pushing back against the grotesque.
Well, it's really easy and popular. It's really easy and popular to be pro-Palestine. And being pro-Palestine is a really great way for a right-winger like Jackson Hinkle or Jake Shields to get a bunch of left-leaning people listening to them and then start slowly poisoning them against the majority of left-wing ideas until they find themselves agreeing with the fascists more than they agree with socialists or communists or anarchists.
I wasn't planning on asking this, but let me ask you something about this. you know, I remember there was a time where once Iraq became the epic catastrophe, humanitarian catastrophe that it was, and the U.S. was not going to win that war. It became very, actually, you still there, Chris?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, good. Sorry. It became very popular for a lot of people who were against the Iraq war to be like, okay, yes, the Iraq war was a catastrophe. They lied to us. But on Iran, the Bush administration and the war hawks on Iran are right about that. And you see a lot of people. I think Piers Morgan is one great example. He was against the Iraq war, but he was very pro-Iran war. We know how much of a craven Zionist, pro-NATO voice he is. And yet a lot of people, when they complain to a George Galloway or to anyone else who waste their time going on Piers Morgan's program, and they would say to him, why are you guys wasting your time going on Piers Morgan's program given his entire history of being a junk journalist? Galloway will say something like, well, he was against the Iraq war and he helped us with the Iraq war. But folks, the Iraq war was the exception, not the rule. Yes, there were millions of people
who let's not forget
before it happened. But that being said, those same people who I think because a lot of people saw the mass protests, a lot of opportunists latched on to, oh yes, I was against the Iraq war from the very beginning.
Let's not forget
they spent the majority of their time advocating that we need endless Cold Wars with Russia, endless Cold Wars with China, supported, the same Bush administration in their destroying of democracy in Haiti and so forth like that. So I think people need to really move on from giving people credit just because a person was against the Iraq war. Like, look, there are lots of people I know who are against the Vietnam War, who are for all the wars of today. And don't realize that corporate media is constantly lying to you and that NGOs lie to you and so forth like that. So I think we also need to move beyond giving too much credit to certain voices when they claim they were against the Iraq war.
Let's all remember that Nixon was against the Vietnam War when he ran against JFK, and how did that turn out when Nixon actually became president?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean...
Now, this is a good, simple standard. If you are willing to put people's health or even lives at risk and are promoting contrarian science or climate denialism, then you're not worth it. And I wish more people had that attitude. I think there are a lot of people who really seem to buy into these ideas that science is some sort of conspiracy controlled by the government and the media. And that's what the right wing wants. That's how people like RFK Jr. get you. The idea that science is just all some scam by the government and the media and corporations. But it's always the people who don't want to listen to the science when it would really benefit us ordinary people for them to do it that say science is a scam.
And I think, but this is this is where although sometimes when the left promotes political education, they say it in a very condescending way, which makes you turn off by it. But this is where political education is very, very important, because I don't know how many times one has to say to somebody that you do know that right-wingers will always grab onto legitimate grievances, legitimate concerns, but their solution is just another remix version of the status quo, except they're in it.
Well, it's like the people who abuse and misrepresent science themselves then claim science is a lie. It's hilarious. On the one hand, they want you to believe people because of their credentials, But then if you point out, well, that guy lost his license, well, no, that was just because he was right and told the truth, so he was punished. Now, there were situations where people were punished for telling the truth, but the people who were punished for telling the truth did not lead to multi-million-dollar movements to continue hiding the truth. It's kind of nobody started a hand washing movement because the guy who said maybe doctors should wash their hands before they put them into bodies. There was no doctors hand washing movement. Patients said, hey, you need to start washing your hands. And eventually it only happened because people really were dying. But the guy who said maybe we should wash our hands was declared insane, and somebody forgot to feed him in an insane asylum.
But it's very difficult because, and I think I remember there was a reason why I had to stop talking to certain people about COVID, because it was just driving me crazy.
Yes,
the conversations were just not going anywhere. Because on the one hand, like I said, the people like RFK Jr. are very good at latching on to legitimate grievances and legitimate concerns.
Yes, and then
so on the one hand, you think to yourself, okay, yes, I do want safe vaccines. I am concerned if such and such a vaccine is going to have some side effects and so forth.
But then you have to ask how legitimate those concerns are, because prior to COVID, most of those concerns were a bunch of shit. And when it comes to COVID, the concerns are actually less about the vaccines themselves than the stupid way the government misrepresented them.
Well, not only that, but at the same time, and this is why, the harsh reality is that unless you have a very strong movement to go to counter people's legitimate grievances going into a very reactionary agenda, the only response when you're dealing with the COVID denialist is you cannot talk to the COVID denialist.
Yeah.
And many people who, and this is why COVID, and this is why
any of these political cults.
This is why I often say COVID minimalism is just an overlap, and it's just a nice way of saying COVID denialism, because the very people who were saying, "Oh, COVID is just like the flu and stuff like that," okay, you can have that opinion, but then why are you joining demonstrations saying that being anti-mask? Why are you protesting against lockdowns as opposed to offering a people's bailouts and stuff like that? So at the end of the day, they are just COVID denialists.
No, they're actually pro-COVID. That's the whole thing. It's actually a pro-COVID, a pro-disease public health campaign where where RFK Jr. is telling people it's good to get sick. Your kids getting sick means they'll be healthier adults. And no, that's not true.
Oh, the whole herd immunity thing, which actually was ironically,
herd immunity, which is a tremendously misused term lately. Herd immunity is based on the idea that you have a significant population of vaccinated people, and the vaccine actually prevents or reduces the likelihood of transmission to a degree that makes it less likely to pass the disease. So basically, when you're talking about something like measles, we rely on herd immunity not to get measles. It's not just that we're all vaccinated.
Yeah.
It's that not only are we all vaccinated, but because so many of us are vaccinated, if someone who's not vaccinated then comes into the system, the not vaccinated person is still protected because everybody else is vaccinated. And because the herd is immune, one unvaccinated person is at a relatively low risk. Now, that said, herd immunity requires that either the vaccine or the disease itself actually prevents further transmission. Now, the reason herd immunity works for the most part with measles is because, number one, the measles vaccine actually greatly reduces your chance of catching the measles. It greatly reduces your chance of transmitting the measles because you're less likely to catch it. The idea, now debunked, was that you needed to be symptomatic to spread COVID, and therefore the vaccine reduced transmission because asymptomatic infections weren't spreading COVID. That turned out to not be true. People spread COVID most during asymptomatic periods just before and just after they got sick. So, which means that not getting symptoms doesn't make you less likely to transmit the disease, which means it just makes it less likely that you will have bad symptoms or die if your vaccinations are up to date for the strain you catch, as opposed to measles, which is if you are vaccinated, number one, and number two, if enough people around you are vaccinated, you probably won't ever catch measles because, number one, you will almost never be exposed to it. And number two, even if you are exposed to it, it's a very small exposure in a very big pool, and you're going to be safe. It's not the same with, but measles doesn't mutate like COVID because COVID has evolved more.
Mm-hmm.
COVID doesn't make you more immune. It makes you less immune. It damages your immune system. Since COVID damages your immune system, the idea of catching COVID to become immune eliminates that aspect of herd immunity entirely. To have any sort of herd immunity, we would have to have a vaccine that actually prevented transmission, which we don't know if it is possible.
Mm-hmm. But then I wonder, since talking about this, which overlaps with the other stuff we've been talking about in RFK Jr., I wonder, how are we going to how do we overcome when the next pandemic shit hits the fans and we're going to be reintroduced with quite a reaction with quite a rebuttal.
If there isn't some sort of course correction, then we're starting to look at the sort of things that can change the world as we know it. Let's not forget that the COVID pandemic has already changed the world as we know it in a whole bunch of ways. One of them, RFK Jr., is taken seriously and has power. So, you've got to figure that anything as bad as COVID happening again under the same circumstances will be more of the same, but worse.
Christ Almighty, that's a very scary thought because
you look at what's already happened because of COVID, and then you ask, okay, so what lessons have we learned that will make things better the next time?
Zero, none.
Exactly. We're repeating all the mistakes made during the Spanish flu pandemic.
which I find is quite scary because the joke I make when talking with my friends, the ones who did not fall into the rabbit hole of COVID denialism, is wow. This is the first pandemic where the response of much of humanity is, I don't give a shit there's a pandemic. Fuck you guys.
Ultimately,
I'm living my life as normal.
Ultimately, that's what was decided to do about the flu. They just, went on, decided we're just going to ignore the flu and live our life normally and make the flu a normal part of life.
You mean the Spanish flu pandemic, when that happened?
Yeah, they just made the flu a normal part of life.
Well, but they also did not have the.
No, I know, but I'm just saying a decision was made to make the flu a normal part of life. In the same way, a decision has been made to make COVID a normal part of life. The difference is COVID is a lot worse than the flu.
Yeah. But at the same time, I do sometimes wonder if the symptoms of COVID were more gruesome, like the Spanish flu and influenza.
COVID's pretty gruesome. COVID's pretty gruesome. The thing is that unless you die of COVID, you're not probably going to experience the gruesome part. Or people don't get as serious. Most people don't get as seriously sick as they used to. And because they're not paying attention as closely, if you do get seriously sick, you're much more likely to die.
Yeah. I shouldn't. Yeah. Should not laugh about
COVID deaths have been up since people stopped masking in 2022. You would think that since we're all just ignoring it, that would mean fewer people are dying of COVID and that fewer people are dying of the flu. But COVID deaths and flu deaths are both up since 2022.
And then when it comes to the whole,
and this is together because they're both airborne diseases transmitted the same way. Every time flu deaths go up, COVID deaths are going up too, and vice versa.
But as for the scamdemics, not even the scamdemic, the ones who believe that this is all a pandemic, people who watch.
That's just more of your right-wing replacement
Resident
theory.
Evil, as if it was a real documentary.
Just another Nazi replacement theory. And they're buying into it, which is just sad. And that's why you hear RFK Jr. say stupid stuff like, well, white people and black people get it, but Jewish people and Asian people don't. Now, keep in mind, this is someone with power in our system saying bullshit like this. Now, on that note, we really should wrap.
Yeah, no, and it's.
Do you have any final thoughts?
Final thoughts? No. Apart from that, I think just that I think that us able-bodied people, I think we need to actually listen way more to the disabled community,
and not just to the disabled community, but to the most misanthropic and cynical disability rights activists you can find.
Yeah, no. I think we need to listen. I think as you have done with your journalism, I think we need to listen to way more the voices of people who are impacted by these, so the disabled community and so forth, because it'll change your life. I think when you actually listen to those voices, you will, those who engaged in COVID minimalism and COVID denialism, and even those who may not have engaged in that, but they engaged in grotesque policies like, I think it would be nice to cut welfare. I think it would be nice if we were much more harder on the welfare cheats. When you're an advocate of stuff like that, you may think you're hurting the welfare cheats. You're not, but who you're really hurting are the disabled communities.
The assumption that these are my final thoughts before I wrap. The assumption that there are a large number of welfare cheats out there and that it will somehow save money while not hurting anybody who actually needs their welfare, if we do something about this alleged cheating, that by itself is a right-wing lie, and accepting it is making a decision to side with the right against workers.
And we have to push back against it. I think enough is enough. If let's learn from the mistakes of the SPD and the Greens and not concede to the rights. Let's not engage in the whole left-right alliance. Let's really build a true left.
If you hate the German Greens, final words before I do my last plug for the show and sign out.
Yeah.
If you hate the German Greens, why would you make the same mistake because the Republicans are the Christian Democratic Union? So on that note, if you support the show, please follow us on Twitter at Eclectic Radical. Follow us on YouTube at Eclectic Radical. Follow the show on Twitter at The Eclectic Rad. And if you would like to support the show even more and help it pay for itself and stay on the air, become a patron at Patreon at Eclectic Radical. I want to thank everybody for joining me. I want to thank Youri for a great show. I will be back next week with my great friends Rachel Kahn and I hate it when I can't talk now.
It's been a long show. It's all good.
Yeah, no, I just have to suddenly remember the last name of somebody whose last name I always know when I'm not thinking about it. It's really frustrating when that happens. It's one of the small creeping disabilities I notice myself suffering as I age a little bit.
Senior moments, folks, and may that be a reminder: do not engage in any kind of ableism or ageism.
You will not be able-bodied forever yourself. If you live long enough, you will be less able to. You will be more disabled. You will understand what it is like to not be able to do everything. Kate Terry, I apologize. Rachel Kahn and Kate Terry will be joining me next week. I do not immediately have a topic, but we will have a great conversation on the air. It's impossible not to. They are literally two of the most interesting people I know. On that note, until next week, I will tweet at you, and everybody take care.